All right, this is At Homes with Reading. We are doing Master and his Emissary. We are on part two of chapter two, reading the next 30 pages. And in charge of the summary for last week's discussion, or the last discussion, was Carter, who is not here today. So he sent what he wrote to Macy, who will read that up for us. So you can screen share anytime, Minky, and we'll go over what we discussed last week.
Okay, can you guys see it?
Yes.
All right. Okay, I gotta minimize myself for a second there. All right, so focus of the chapter is what do the hemispheres do? A lot of it is the same, but we need to get at the differences to really understand the hemispheres. Like different cars, there are far more similarities than differences between the hemispheres. Much like the cars, the point of comparing them is to focus on their differences. Structure. Right hemisphere is longer, wider, and larger than the left. Greater interconnectivity and white matter in the right hemisphere than the left hemisphere. Sensitive to different neurotransmitters and hormones. The right hemisphere is more sensitive to testosterone, left hemisphere more reliant on dopamine, and right hemisphere on noradrenaline. Understanding the individual roles of the hemispheres. How can we do this? 1. Studying subjects with brain lesions. 2. Temporary experimental hemisphere deactivations. WADA procedure. 3. How do you say that?
No idea.
Tachyscope, which delivers a visual stimulus to one half of the brain only. 4. Dichotic listening techniques, delivering different auditory stimuli to the hemispheres via headphones. We can use a variety of functional imaging techniques to see which areas of the brain are preferentially performing a task. However, neuroimaging is limited. It can be affected by novelty or complexity of the task, handedness, race, or age. So it is ineffective as a sole line of evidence. Mode of attention. The left hemisphere has a more focused and selective attention. The right hemisphere is on the lookout. It is open to whatever exists apart from ourselves without preconceptions. It is a broader and more flexible form of attention. Vigilance and sustained attention are impaired in subjects with right hemispheric lesions, so you'd be relying on your left hemisphere. Intensity of attention is the domain of the right hemisphere. Selectivity of attention is more the domain of the right hemisphere. What is new must come into focus for the right hemisphere before it can be apprehended by the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere deals with the known, while the right hemisphere deals with the new. The right hemisphere can make broad connections, which helps enable creativity. The left hemisphere can actually suppress the right to avoid making these connections. The left hemisphere is more self-referential and interconnected within itself. How does this work with what he said earlier about the right hemisphere having greater interconnectivity? Right hemisphere is better at bringing together different kinds of information from the different senses. Noradrenic, yeah, how do you say that? Noradrenic neurons in the right hemisphere do not fatigue. So that exploratory attention is held open across a greater expanse of space and time, which is different from most neurons. Hierarchy of attention. H and 4, for example. Most would see. Oh, I see. So in the book, there's an example, and I think that if I am able to bring that up now, give me a moment. So
yeah, I don't have the screenshot.
I don't know if people can see my screen, but I'll hold it up, and it's this. So inside this H is a bunch of mini E's, and inside the 4 is a bunch of mini 8s, actually. So hierarchy of attention, H and 4 example, most would see those images as an H and a 4. In schizophrenic patients, they just appear as a mass of E's and 8s. So in that example, the left hemisphere is only able to see the bits, whereas the right hemisphere is able to see the whole. The right hemisphere is concerned about the world as a whole. The left hemisphere can only grasp what it is in the right visual or auditory field, which is the part that it uses. Example, the pictures of the clock, the house, and the cats is copied by patients with neglect. Yeah, so what he's referring to is also this. So it shows that there's only a second half that gets negated by the left hemisphere because it's only dealing with what it knows, which is the right side of its visual field.
Yeah, so the pictures on the left were the templates that the patient, relying on their left hemisphere, were supposed to replicate, but they could only replicate the part of which they saw, which the left hemisphere can only see on the right visual field.
Mm-hmm. Gestalt perception, the right hemisphere sees the whole before it is broken up into parts. Patients with right hemisphere lesions, relying on the left, can draw when asked, but the drawings are only a jumble of parts. Where there are left hemisphere lesions, relying on your right hemisphere, drawings often exhibit a poverty of detail. Anything that requires indirect interpretation depends on the right frontal lobe. The left hemisphere identifies by labels rather than context. The left hemisphere works in abstraction by following the internal logic of a situation instead of understanding things in context in the world. Left hemisphere can only represent. Right hemisphere can only give what makes itself present. And then I believe there's another section. The left hemisphere cannot understand metaphor or humor. The right hemisphere can make finer discriminations within categories. The left hemisphere presents generic, non-specific objects. Left hemisphere enjoys collecting, organizing, and grasping things, even at the expense of the context of the things. The right hemisphere right hemisphere deficit syndromes, Capgras syndrome, a person who they know very well is represented by an imposter. For Goli syndrome, the belief that someone who someone knows is duplicated in different places at different times. And that even goes for places. Right hemisphere is more interested in the personal. Left hemisphere is more interested in the abstract. Right hemisphere is more concerned with living individuals. Left hemisphere is more concerned with man-made objects. The body as a whole is the domain of the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere deals with body parts. Example, Aaron Wald's patient with a right hemisphere stroke who could only see a wooden plank where the left half of his chest, abdomen, and stomach. Right, so that's talking about the effect where if the left hemisphere just has no understanding of one half of its body, it'll replace it with an inanimate object. The left hemisphere has a primary affinity for utility, and so it likes making tools and grasping. The right hemisphere is the mediator of empathy. When I think of my pain, it is in both hemispheres. When I think of your pain, it is in my right hemisphere. Theory of mind is the capacity to put oneself in another person's position and see what is going on in their mind. Children acquire the capacity at around the age of 4. Mirror neurons exist in both hemispheres, and their activation depends on how oriented the action they are imitating is. Emotional context is primarily experienced in the right hemisphere. It is more connected with the limbic system, which is the primal seat of emotions. It also is responsible for identifying emotional expression. When the left hemisphere is asked to identify emotions, it does not look at the eyes, but at the mouth. Prosopagnosia, an inability to combine the component features into a configurational facial representation that would uniquely define each face, characteristic of right hemisphere damage. Interestingly, the left half of the face is more involved in emotional expression. We also show an affinity for cradling infants with their faces to the left, which exposes the infants to the adult's own more expressive left hemiface. That is it.
Yeah, that last one, I was curious when I first did this book on audio. I understood and was learning that my mom's got a bit more of a left hemisphere proclivity, and I was wondering, okay, even with a left hemisphere proclivity, do you still instinctively hold the baby to your left side, giving it access to your right hemisphere? And when I asked her, she said, yeah, I carried all the babies on the left. So even with the proclivities, there's certain like biological and intuitive things that the right hemisphere just still takes over, which I thought was really neat.
If we'd like, do we want to pull that up one more time if anyone has any questions on some of that?
What was the little selection on the imposter idea? I didn't quite fully get
Mm.
how that would what that meant exactly.
Okay.
It's a syndrome that Capgras syndrome, a person who they know very well is re-represented by an imposter, and this other syndrome, I
Yeah,
didn't.
so the syndrome is kind of like thinking that a person, like what it quite literally says is that you think that you know is like they've been that's not them, you know, that's an imposter, like that's a re-representation of them, but that's not them, you know what I mean? And so the left hemisphere has, I think the reason it gets this syndrome in the first place is because what it will do with people is it'll take a person and place it into this form of stasis, right? So I can like look at you, Matthew, and be like, this is Matthew in a box, essentially, right? And I think that the syndrome basically puts you in stasis where it's like it no longer now is able to recognize the boundaries that it put of this person, so they think it's an imposter. There was an example where it was like a man who said that it's almost like his wife comes home and she's a different person. Whereas like the right hemisphere would be aware of the fact that this is not a different person. It's still the wife, just in a different way. And because we're complex, changing creatures and beings, right? But the left hemisphere would be like, no, that's not my wife. Like,
Yeah, the simple example was a haircut. You know,
Yep.
the spouse had left the house, got a haircut, came back, and because this person had right hemisphere damage, they thought it was an entirely different person.
Wow.
Which is really insane. When in our last discussion, I compared it to that feeling of betrayal. You know, if your spouse cheats on you or something, suddenly the left hemisphere, the map it had of your spouse and your boyfriend, suddenly just completely disappears. Now the left hemisphere has to remap. So this person appears completely foreign to you, even though it's really just they made a decision that hurt your feelings and was, you know, against all the context around it. But that's the feeling of betrayal when something completely rips the rug from under you.
Mhm.
Yeah, the left hemisphere sees people as a generalized sum of their parts, and so as soon as one thing changes contextually, the left hemisphere is completely lost and will double down on the idea that that can't be the same person because it thinks that its static fixed position is the position without the right hemisphere to give it the context that something has changed, but it's still that person. They're not just the sum of their individual components.
Yeah, and that's why even with Bergoli syndrome, then it like it could look like it's a complete opposite, but it's really not, because that one's the belief that someone knows is duplicated in different places at different times, almost like now there's multiple of this thing. It's still under the categorization though of this thing. This person can be put into stasis, so therefore, oh look, they're everywhere. They're re-represented.
Or I guess in that sense, somebody who has similar attributes or character traits to that person I've identified as this person. Now all of a sudden I see another person with the similar attributes, and I'm like, oh, that's their identity. It's built.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah,
similar
yes.
syndrome. I don't remember the name of it, but it's where you see copies of what you think is the same individual because of that very thing, where they see very similar traits and then
Yeah, because it is
treat
the
it as
right
the same person.
hemisphere that can differentiate uniqueness. So it's like the left hemisphere knows its categories. So that's a good example, Matthew, because that is something where the left hemisphere would see. It's like, look, all these people are the same because they have similar characteristics, where the right hemisphere knows that that is a unique individual difference and they're different people.
Mhm.
Do we want to pick somebody? Do we have any volunteers to do the synopsis for next week's discussion, or?
Oh, I was gonna just nominate Kyle to do it.
No, I got this one. I'll do the synopsis.
Okay.
It's fun to see the different styles of synapses too, because Macy took the first one and she almost did like a full-on narrative, whereas Carter took and did bullet points, which was, yeah. And took literal definitions and syndrome. So it's just fascinating seeing everybody's mode of attention, even to this something as simple as the synapses.
I'm going to chuck Matthew as the guy that when we get into the section where we actually have the historical references of where the hemisphere is actually imprinted on history, when he brings up that information, if Matt actually gets that under his belt by the time you guys get there, Matthew, that will be yours. You will do the synopsis of that.
I will be
that's going to light you up.
Okay.
I would do it, but I feel like I won't be able to capture every single detail. So just be very plain.
It's yours. That's why I like it. It's yours. You make it yours. You make it beautiful. You do.
I wouldn't worry about capturing every single detail. There's nobody here is going to be capable of doing.
If you put in genuine effort, then we will be thankful for it.
Yeah.
So do you feel called to, Noah, to do the synopsis for this one?
Maybe not this one.
Okay, I'll do this one, and then I'll get back to you on the next one. Okay. We can start sharing pages, I suppose. I got way too many. But normally how this ends up working out is that other people's also check off mine. So does anybody have something right off the top that really jumped out to them, a page number or something they just totally over the head didn't understand that they want to start with? Or shall I nominate somebody to go first? Nomination it is. Okay, Macy.
I'm flipping through because I'm trying to find it because you always nominate me.
Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep.
Lovely.
I think I can pull it up on my laptop and screen share again.
Yep.
Okay. It seems to play an important role in episodic memory, which is critical for personal identity and in adopting the first-person perspective. And in fact, deductive logic is also associated with the right ventromedial prefrontal area of the brain, an area known to be devoted to emotion and feeling. Seeing what follows from a social, emotional understanding of the situation in which one finds oneself in the real world is at least as important then as seeing what follows from an abstract proposition. So for me, when we're talking about episodic memory, the reason why I bring this up and why I think it's so cool is because when it says seeing what follows from a social emotional understanding of the situation in which one finds oneself in the real world is at least as important as kind of game theorying from an abstract proposition. I know, Matthew, we don't think game theorying is the same thing, but what I mean is when you're actually, I guess, theorizing abstractly ideas and concepts, episodic memory is more so almost like memory of daily lived experiences. So I think that I bring this up because I think it's really important for it's in the realm of the right hemisphere as the page just associated. But I think it's really important because there's an affiliation when it comes to the left hemisphere of really not remembering context if recognizing it at all. And I think that with episodic memory, the reason why I brought it up is because I think that it plays such a crucial role in contextual understanding because it's like if you are in a conversation with somebody and you can remember what it is that you said, if you can remember what it is that they said, then that is garnering context and that is sustained attention. That is memory. And I think that that's a huge role in the right hemisphere's realm and domain, whereas the left hemisphere, it's like some people, they can't remember a conversation to save their life. It's like they can't even remember what they said. You know what I mean? So I think that differentiation is important.
A real life example where that plays it out and does for me anyways, like if when I have been in conversations with people and there's a disagreement, there's a little bit of an altercation and it's like you said this thing. It's like, actually I didn't say that thing. And you know, they'll have this picture in their brain about how the conversation went, but they don't recall how it actually ended up playing out. And that occurs if it's helpful to have episodic memory when those situations come up because you're like arguing with this individual and they don't remember how it played out, or they just latched on to certain parts, but they dissociated it from the context of which the conversation was overall having. Or even there's some people I've met where you can start a conversation, go for like an hour, and they can't tell you where it started at the beginning. So that it's just that context of episodic memory, just for the sake of um, continual flow and being able to branch everything together. Like even both Matthew and my dad here, both of you guys are really good at bringing it full circle, even with all the context that you guys bring in. So it's like that is really good episodic memory because it relies on the right hemisphere.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
I guess
you end up with the wheelhouse too, right? That part where it gets short-term memory in, you get caught in semantics. All of a sudden, left hemisphere is more concerned about the words, and then forgets like how that flow of all those words made the sentences and the paragraphs to give you the episodic story. So that's when all of a sudden people start spinning like their tires in an argument per se, or even like a discussion, even if it leads to an argument. And then all of a sudden you're starting to get caught up in words and phrases versus the context of what's the action, where were we going in this conversation, how did this conversation arise, and that's the right hemisphere's wheelhouse, right? All those extra inputs to add to the conversation. But yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just thinking about The Simpsons. Remember the first few seasons of The Simpsons? There was like a coherent storyline and a moral at the end of the story. You know, Homer, he's falling for another girl at work, and he's having visions of Mandy, and then all of a sudden by the end, a whole bunch of experience happening. He ends up rediscovering his love for Marge and blah blah blah. So, but all of the funny jokes are all being set within a compositional framework that is taking you somewhere that has a sort of a gestalt quality to it, a whole integrated quality to it. And then somewhere along the way, I don't know if it was like season 9 or season 10 or something, things started like just falling apart, and it became increasingly just a bunch of disjointed jokes with a barely running theme throughout the whole thing, never a moral theme as far as a punchline. And then I just saw that as sort of a reflection of the decay of overall thinking within the society as a whole, right? Where people all of a sudden, you just listen, sometimes you're at a cafe and you're just overhearing conversations around you, and it's just random feelings, disjointed, no compositional points or ideas in the general way people are thinking and speaking. So it becomes much more difficult if they were to ask, well, to recapitulate any of the points that were brought up, because there were no points. There was just like words based on like, you know, details and details, but no whole.
Oh, I got a great section that we got to put in. Okay, page 76.
Okay, we are going to page 76.
Long because it plays really well into what Matthew just said.
Oh, you have it right there. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Cyril.
All right.
You could do Control F if you have a couple of keywords.
Is it the section at the bottom of the page, Macy?
Go from what is called temporal sequencing.
Oh, found it.
Okay, that top of the page.
All right, I'm going to go on reading. Okay. What is called temporal sequencing is an ambiguous concept. Such sequencing, depending on what one means by that, may be right hemisphere dependent, or at least where the sequence has no real-world meaning, as it would in a narrative, left hemisphere dependent. The understanding of a narrative or of narrative is a right hemispheric skill. The left hemisphere can follow a narrative, but sequencing in the sense cannot follow a narrative. But sequencing in the sense of the ordering of artificially decontextualized, unrelated momentary events or momentary interruptions of temporal flow, the kind of thing that is as well or better performed by the left hemisphere, is not in fact a measure of the sense of time at all. It is precisely what takes over when the sense of time breaks down. Time is essentially an undivided flow. The left hemisphere's tendency to break it up into units and make machines to measure it may succeed in deceiving us that it is a sequence of static points. But such a sequence never approaches the nature of time, however close it gets. This is another instance of how something that does not come into being for the left hemisphere is represented by it in non-living mechanical form, the closest approximation as it sees it, but always remaining on the other side of the gulf that separates the two worlds, like a series of tangents that approaches ever more closely to a circle without ever actually achieving it, a machine that approximates, however well, the human mind, yet has no consciousness, a Frankenstein's monster of body parts that never truly lives, a condition called pelinopsia, in which there is disturbance and fragmentation of the normal flow of visual experience, or abnormal persistence over time of images causing visual trails, is caused by posterior right hemisphere lesions. And similar phenomena, a loss of fluidity of motion through time, in other modalities than sight are probably similarly associated with deficits in the right posterior cortex. Under such conditions, the right hemisphere ability to perceive flow as a single unified motion across time is lost. It becomes replaced in the left hemisphere's timeless but mechanical world by the summing of an infinite series of static moments, rather like the succession of frames in a cinema film, known as the Zetreffer phenomenon.
And how are you connecting that, Macy?
Because it's almost like those the right hemisphere is the ability to understand narrative and flow. And when at the very end, when it's mentioning the left hemisphere is almost like fragmented, like a cinema film, almost like it will go from, I guess, points and static images, but it doesn't actually keep the consistent flow of the story in mind. So it's almost like just flashes. So that's how I'm relating it to what he was talking about before.
And that gets backed up in chapter 3 of The Matter with Things, because we're getting into the actual visual field, and the left hemisphere actually sees life in static moments. So that flicker film sensation, it's not just a sensation. That's how the left hemisphere views the world. That's how you get tracers, right? And so between the two hemispheres, the tracers, like so even when you have your hand, you move it quickly, or you see the refraction of light after you pass a match by. It's like that flow of time and of that actual thing passing through the visual field is fully taken into context by the right hemisphere's visual perception, whereas the left hemisphere is constantly trying to take a picture of it in motion, and it's that picture in motion that actually gives you that sense of the tracer when you're watching it. It's in chapter 3 in Perception with his new book.
That's cool. It's really cool how he's reading that alongside us reading this, because we'll just progress together and then he'll be able to back up everything as we go.
That just short. Sorry, I don't want to like take over all the space, but
no, that's fine. That's fine.
But it's funny because the left hemisphere, when it does this, I guess, fragmented line of thinking where it just sees flashes of things and it's never sequential, it's never in a flow state, and hence why they're even talking about the concept of time. It's like we measure time according to these static points, which is more of the left hemisphere's domain, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the nature of time is. It's not just these static points. We use it for our manipulation in our lived process of what we're doing in this world, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what time is. And it's no different than even the relationship that you have with people and even of yourself, because the left hemisphere is more apt, like we were mentioning at the beginning, to, I guess, categorize people into these forms of stasis through labels. I believe that was mentioned before, where it does labeling in the summary. So even with I know from like my personal experience, like I am the type of person where I will label myself all the time and categorize myself as this thing. And then I forget to step back into what has always been, which is time, because I will like catastrophize thinking, oh no, like because I'm this thing, I'm going to be this thing for the rest of my life type of thing, but not failing to realize that you're part of a flowing living thing, and because you are living, you therefore are capable of change and are changing. So like that's a bit more of the philosophy of the left hemisphere towards itself and others, is it'll just see these static moments, but it won't take into consideration that you're part of this flowing process of time and space.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple screenshots that are right within that section, and it's a dense section because not only is he talking about the nature of time to the two hemispheres, but he also talks about music, because somebody's understanding of time can alter their understanding of music, again, depending on the mode of attention that's coming. So my screenshot had started here. This superiority has nothing to do with a greater affinity for auditory material. For one thing, music is in most respects better appreciated by the right hemisphere. To the extent that there is an auditory superiority for language in the left hemisphere, it is in any case due to its inhibitory effect on the right hemisphere. That personally resonated with me because I work with mom and dad all the time, and I like to listen to either a podcast or music while I do the work. And I always put my earbud with the music in my left ear. And then I keep the right ear open because my mom likes to talk to me and give me instructions during the job. And every time I tried switching it, I had a harder time recognizing my mom. And and I didn't realize that until reading this, that my left hemisphere, my right ear, would capture my mom's auditory instructions better due to its inhibitory effect. And then my right hemisphere, left ear, would appreciate the music better. I was like, wow, even intuitively, I was doing this thing, not understanding.
Right on.
Rather, the superiority for language stems from its nature as the hemisphere of representation, in which signs are substituted for experience. If it were not for this, one might have expected sign language, which is visuospatial rather than verbal in nature, to be dealt with in the right hemisphere. But despite that, sign language is left hemisphere mediated. And disturbances of sign language in deaf subjects are also consistently associated with left hemisphere damage, the resulting deficits being typically analogous to the language problems experienced by hearing subjects with a lesion in the same location. This proves that the specialization of what is called the auditory cortex is not to do with the processing of auditory material or even of words themselves. It is to do with the processing of signs, tokens, representations of things, whether these be verbal or visuospatial. And equally, the supposed visuospatial bias of the right hemisphere is probably not about visuospatial qualities in themselves, but because this is the main root of perception of the external world, of things in and of themselves, as opposed to their signs. Once again, the stereotypes are wrong. The left hemisphere may have a lot to do with language, but the right hemisphere plays a vital part in language too. It uses language not in order to manipulate ideas or things, but to understand what others mean. This silent hemisphere recognizes words and has vocabulary, as discussed above, and even some aspects of syntax. In fact, not just language reception, but expression too, is highly right hemisphere dependent. The verbal expression problems of right hemisphere damaged patients can be severe, and it has been suggested that they are almost as severe as those of left hemisphere damaged patients.
So is there an auditory cortex in both hemispheres?
So their auditory, one thing we got to bear in mind here is that it's not like we're getting examples where they turn off hemispheres in order to be able to garner the evidence. Or someone's had a natural, patient, someone that's actually had some sort of damages or lesions or whatnot in order to be able to understand this downstream effect. So it's more along the lines of not so much do they separate, it's when each hemisphere accesses the system that is within the brain. I guess if that would be a more
No, thank
I have
you.
a quick question of definition. Do you guys hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So when we're talking about right and left hemisphere, just quick question of definition, is that the right and left of the cerebrum, or would that be including the peripheral and the like the optical kind of the back of the brain and stuff, or are we just talking about the cerebrum? So that wouldn't necessarily have to do with auditory, or does that have to do with it as well? I'm not sure.
Well, auditory is going to still, like, you have a right ear and you have a left ear. So they're going to receive, and that goes right into your nervous system, right? And to the limbic system, which has direct access. So as the brain evolved or whatnot, it's like then the systems like the corpus callosum became an inhibitor because specializations of bilateral communication. This is one of the big things why Gilchrist is trying to basically blow apart the stereotypes, because that was what he mentioned when you guys read his introduction. He's like, these are the things that people are presuming about the brain, and that would be fine, except for the fact that they're all wrong. So it's when you're going into right hemisphere and left hemisphere, when they shut down with the WADA technique, or there is a severing of the corpus callosum, as they used to do in split brain patients before they stopped that practice. Right. The hemisphere is still, each hemisphere is still built on top of the old brain, I guess, if you will, to put it into a layman's term. So there's access. Each one has the access. Like both ears are going to feed information and your eyes are going to feed information. It's just a matter of which hemisphere's mode of attention is going to placate, be sort of like that's why the master and the emissary is the metaphor that gets used, because there's a betrayal that happens from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. So as you guys are going to read and learn throughout, it's like there's sections that the right hemisphere will abdicate because the left hemisphere's sort of handling of the situation is perfectly fine in the context of a situation. Whereas if you willingly choose to go out of your way to try to actually have your right hemisphere play the role, like say, for example, you're right-handed and you do the thing with the right hand because the left hemisphere is all about manipulating, grabbing, and sort of like putting its will into motion through power and manipulation. Well, you can actually get your left hand, which would be right hemisphere modality, to be as efficient, if not even more, than your right hand, but that takes conscious effort, time, right? So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but it's like, well, when it's being mentioned, we're talking about the newer structures on the old structure, but both hemispheres has access throughout the whole system, right? Like Gilchrist had mentioned even earlier that the fact that he has to put this in a book is a betrayal of the right hemisphere, so to speak, because it's putting the brain into stasis for the sake of explanation, but only temporally. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
Yeah, I suppose this is a good section to kind of go off of, because he actually delves into this is one of the only sections that I can recall where he delves into that, because your question, Jeremiah, about like, is he talking about the right and left hemispheres as the frontal lobes versus some of the more limbic and structures near the posterior? Like Dad just said, both hemispheres have access to all of those things and use them in different manners. And here's a huge example of that. It's right at the beginning of this section, and it's actually on depression. And this is where you really have to consider the front to back problem, the anterior being front, posterior being back, where it kind of brings in those more dynamic of the brain, like the other parts and hemispheres interacting with them. So we can read this here. The issue of the relationship between depressive illness and the right hemisphere is complex. Here, more than anywhere, one has to take into account the influence of the anterior, posterior, front to back axis of the brain, as well as the right to left axis. It seems that the polarity of emotional timbre between the two hemispheres is specifically tied to the most highly and lately evolved, most human parts of the brain, the frontal lobes. Left anterior lesions, frontal lesions, are as associated with depression, and right anterior lesions, again the front, are associated with undue cheerfulness. The closer the left hemisphere lesion lies to the frontal pole, the greater the depressive symptomology. For those with right hemisphere lesions, the converse is true. The more caudal, the further back the lesion, the greater the chance of depression. This confluence of evidence suggests that the right frontal pole has a depressive stance compared with either the left frontal pole or its own parietal occipital cortex. Depression per se is probably associated with reduced right posterior activity in addition to increased right frontal activity in most cases. Although, as one might predict, threat monitoring is a right posterior activity. That's right back. There is evidence of left hemisphere overactivity in mania, the polar opposite of depression, and this may also obtain in other mammals.
And is this would be a lived symptom for someone with bipolar? Literally that problem.
There's more. I'll read this and then we can kind of go into it a bit because it's a dense subject, especially for for me personally, as being a young woman. I feel like as young people and not knowing our proclivities, sometimes we get depressive states, often as adolescents, but it looks differently depending on our proclivity. So just understanding how our brain works and our proclivities and then what depression looks like for each hemisphere, you can almost predict what, if you ever have kids or you're dealing with another generation, other young people, what they're going to go through. And then you understand how each hemisphere is tapping into the limbic system and responding, and you can help them adapt to their own proclivities and their brains as developing kids. So this last little section on this is there's also evidence that the types of depression experienced in right posterior hypoactivity, so that's the right back again, are different from those experienced in left frontal hypoactivity in ways which are in keeping with the views of the world that the two hemispheres bring into being. Thus, depression resulting from damage to the right hemisphere has more of an indifference or apathy, a global, vague lifelessness, in contrast to the anxious, disturbed depression accompanied by biological features resulting from lesions to the left hemisphere. The sort of anxiety that accompanies depressed mood and could be induced by reading a sad narrative is known as anxious arousal and shows greater lateralization to the right hemisphere. By contrast, anxious apprehension, based as it is on a fear of uncertainty and lack of control, preoccupations of the left hemisphere, is accompanied by preferential left hemisphere activation. In interpreting all neuroimaging studies of emotion, one should bear in mind the strictures of Jack Panksepp, probably the world's most distinguished neuroscientist of affect and emotion, that we are more likely to be imaging the areas associated with the cognitive content of an affective state than those associated with the precognitive affective state itself.
I have a question, but keep it up so that way I'm like on this question. So when Yanni and I first read this, this can be a question for maybe like Dad or somebody else, but it says like, thus depression resulting from damage to the right hemisphere is more of indifference or apathy, a global vague lifelessness, and then it goes on to say that there's another form resulting from lesions to the left hemisphere. When I read this, I was thinking that, okay, so the depression that is kind of like a vague lifelessness is like the left hemisphere's version of depression. And then in contrast, the anxious, disturbed depression accompanied by biological features resulting from lesions to the left hemisphere, I thought was the right hemisphere's version of depression. And then Maddie, you were the one that said that you thought it was the opposite.
Yeah, I was just confused if he was talking about, so they talk about right hemisphere lesions. We were just talking about the front to back problem. So I wonder if he meant, right hemisphere lesions, meaning you're relying on your left, or right hemisphere posterior lesions, meaning you're relying on the right anterior, the front of the right. I didn't know if he meant front to back lesions or left to right. Perhaps both, but.
Well, he makes the statement in contrast, or sorry, a global vague lifelessness in contrast to the anxious, disturbed depression accompanied by biological features, because we have the empathy system is in the wheelhouse of the right hemisphere and the internal manipulative reflection. So I think that from what I've gathered from his work, because I'm painting some other chapters that you guys are gonna get to help sort of explain this with a little more detail. I actually think that at this stage it's is under Macy's line of thinking in this
Okay.
is that this is just about the individuality. Like these are early signatures for one to understand perhaps even where they are in their own brain development, especially like I would see this in teenagers like all the time, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, right, but both facets of it, because I think almost everybody here, other than the old timers, you guys are all in the process of your brains finishing. So like for the fellas, it ends around 25, 26, if I'm not mistaken. And for the girls, it's 23 in that process. And obviously like that's a broad stroke brush. There's individual anomalies, of course. So, and the thing is like, that's why like I've literally watched where you have like, you know, your teenage girl is aware of her family and considerations and seems to be able to integrate really well on a community and social level. And then all of a sudden, when the left hemisphere's frontal cortex starts its development in teenagehood, they get entirely narcissistic. They get totally vain. They use negativity to describe their community around them versus positivity, right? And then from boys, this is where they get highly more aggressive. They have a tendency to think that they know more than they actually do, right? Because that would be the left hemisphere taking little bits of information and coming to large conclusions. So this is where, you know, the young men start to get more aggressive with their physical demonstration, anger, which that's faster access by the left hemisphere to the limbic system, the flight or fight mechanisms, because in the matter with things, he demonstrates that there's actually milliseconds of dominance of the left hemisphere accessing those systems, especially as each section starts to come online with the human being. And this doesn't get put into our education system, which is really unfortunate, because this would literally allow an individual to understand what is actually happening to them inside their skull and why it's playing out and manifesting. And it would also let parents, if they can keep in context, you know, when it wasn't that long ago that they too were this sort of idiot, so to speak, but not totally an idiot, but you're in this place of development. And then as an addition, it's the right hemisphere that finishes up last. So then that's when you come back into your social structure and you find yourself sort of a little more community orientated. And this is why you can start to get, your mind goes after information for context, career choice. And then you also unfortunately go through the need to save the world syndrome, which why would that happen? Well, because now the right frontal cortex is coming into its last stages of development. And this is what gets weaponized by to university students. This is why the professors and the university students get weaponized by indoctrination, because now they're coming into a more complete sort of world view, but it's not because you need more time, more context, more lived experience, more interaction and negotiation with your community around you to become that better citizen. But you bypass, it's almost like you jumpstart. And then this is what I tend to see when you kind of go into, now you have more knowledge. So the left hemisphere adds the meta pattern to the right hemisphere. And then this is why people in their early 20s can be weaponized for color revolutions and these types of things. So yeah, pretty cool.
Friedrich Schiller described the need to temper the poet's zeal with worldliness, because that type of energy, that youthful energy of wanting, you know, very natural things. We all want to be a part of something bigger that's tied to a mission. All of these things that has been used by really dark forces who manipulated like the Crusades. You know, it was mostly young 20 years old people in their teens who were like the first ones to be sent off to the to be cannon fodder in the Crusades, and every single manipulation since then. So yeah, temper the poet's zeal with worldliness.
Well, now you know why that individual writes that. They're writing because this is an actual physical manifestation, and it's irrefutable, because the one thing that can't be argued is everybody on the planet, regardless of color, they have a brain. And since it's doing this thing, then that pattern, even though it can be described in all sorts, so usually the artists get there first, right? So they do the songs and the poetry and the films and the dramas, because they are recognizing something first in those dynamics, which is most people with right hemisphere proclivities, they are your artists, they are your poets. So it's kind of neat. They are your musicians too.
Well, what's interesting about the previous section that we read on language and how even the right hemisphere could have lesions that then cause a disruption in the ability to use language. But then the right hemisphere is typically the thing that also utilizes or recognizes metaphor, the oneness that organizes the many parts of a thing. So the language is typically the formalization of ideas that you put symbolic labels onto, but then that act of putting a symbolic label onto a living idea kind of crystallizes it, like uh what was just said about how we create self images for ourselves. We falsely give ourselves a label that then crystallizes us, right? And disrupts our ability to actually be the living, flowing, changing person that we actually are. So, but it's useful to do labels too. It's useful to have language, but you want to give it its proper thing, right? And the interesting thing, based on what you were just saying, was that I was thinking about Percy Shelley in this A Defense of Poetry, which is a beautiful essay.
Mm.
Have you guys heard of this essay, In Defense of Poetry? You've heard of it?
Sorry,
Yeah?
Jeremiah?
Who wrote it?
Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet.
Oh, haven't heard of it. No, I haven't.
Oh, it's beautiful. And he's making a case against the utilitarians at the time in England in the 1800s, early
Oh,
1800s, who were
okay.
saying like the artist isn't really useful anymore because now we're in the industrial age when we just need to have like economists and mechanics. But we don't.
Realists kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
realists,
Yeah.
yeah. And he's like, well, actually, and he does this beautiful thing, and he makes the point that the entire English language itself is the consequence of poetry. And he invented like a whole bunch of words came out of, I mean, Shakespeare directly influenced something like 2,000 words that we take for granted. We don't know where they came from, but they came out. It couldn't be like Shakespeare just forced a word onto us. It had to occur within a story on a theater stage, right? Where he had ideas that there weren't words for, and that he created something which then resonated with the audience because it was alive. It had a context within a story that shaped its meaning, and that people then were like, okay, I'm gonna use that. And it just evolved our language without even realizing. Like we weren't thinking about it, it just happened in that sense.
I have a screenshot that like responds directly to that, and even the talk or the sense
I love
itself.
how the context, even though of these screenshots, it's like this book, guys, it's literally describing life. Like,
Yeah, no, like every aspect, literally every aspect.
aspect of life.
Music and time, reason versus rationality. He even puts it into nice categories for those who need the categorical thinking. Is responding, giving more context, building upon that beautiful little excerpt by Matthew. The right hemisphere appears to be crucially involved in the process of deductive reasoning, a process which is independent not only of left hemisphere language areas, but also of right hemisphere visuospatial areas. For example, even in the absence of any correlated visual input, where problems are presented acoustically via headphones, different types of reasoning problems evoke activity in the right superior parietal cortex and bilaterally in the precuneus. That the precuneus is involved is in itself interesting because the precuneus, a center that lies deep inside the parietal lobe, is deeply connected both with emotion, it forms part of the limbic system, and the sense of self. It is one of the brain's most consistently hot spots with a high resting metabolic rate, and it goes quiet in altered states of consciousness where the sense of self is no longer active, such as sleep, anesthesia, and vegetative states. It seems to play an important role in episodic memory, which is critical for personal identity and in adopting the first-person perspective. And in fact, deductive logic is also associated with the right ventromedial prefrontal area of the brain, an area known to be devoted to emotion and feeling. Seeing what follows from a social, emotional understanding of the situation in which one finds oneself in the real world is at least as important, then, as seeing what follows from an abstract proposition. One finding that might seem at first sight unexpected, but the full significance of which will become apparent only in the next chapter, is that it is the right hemisphere that has the intuitive sense of numbers and their relative size. However, the sense is approximate and does not have precision. The left hemisphere, by contrast, has precision, but it has no intuitive sense of what it is actually doing, other than following rules and manipulating symbols. If one acquires a computational skill leading to a precise answer, it will be most evident in the language in which it was acquired. There's no such language effect in relation to an inexact estimation, the intuitive sense of size. It is worth considering that numbers can either signify absolutes, a quantifiable amount, as in statistics, which would suggest an affinity with the left hemisphere, or signify relations, which would suggest an affinity with the right hemisphere. For Pythagoras, it was this regularity of proportion or relationship, rather than number in any absolute sense, that underpinned music and beauty, the music of the spheres, the natural harmony of the universe. And Matthew, that just screamed the work that you made us do regarding even trying to figure out the those equations. I don't know what they're called.
Pythagorean theorem?
Yeah, that and what you made us do about trying to take the square and then expand it and then rotate it and expand and rotate.
Well, yeah, no, it's striking. Yeah, I appreciated this a lot. And yeah, the idea that we treat number as if it's just one thing, and it's like, no, it could be that thing. It could be a thing you count with, and then as he says, that would be more left hemispheric thing. But then more rightly, number is a reflection of qualities of relationships, and that gives to it a different role that they play, which is more, I think, important even than the quantity side of things. But that's great.
Yeah, I believe that this is why Kepler is more correct than people give credit for in the grand scheme of someone who's figured out the harmonic relationship of our solar system in conjunction with radioactive, electromagnetic, fields and whatnot. It's like, yeah, that's pretty dope.
Very dope indeed.
Well, that and then it also relates to necessary distance, which is also the realm of the right hemisphere in context of space and time. It's like, because when it comes to the right hemisphere's understanding of space, it's more of like a distance thing. It's more like what's further from me or closer to me type of thing, instead of just this linear above and below kind of thing. And so I think that with numbers and thinking them in relationship to each other and in that sense really kind of, well, Maddie brings up depth, and I think that that's true. It's this necessary distance kind of relationship. But
I'm tired of reading, so does anybody want to read this for me? Just this section right here?
I nominate Kyle.
Yeah, I got it. You just the only part on the page there?
Yep, I won't move a thing.
Okay, so the equivalent of time in the visual realm could be thought of as a spatial depth. Indeed, since Einstein, we have came to understand that in time and space are aspects of one entity. As it is the right hemisphere that gives us depth, our senses of time in the visual realm, it is the right hemisphere that gives us the means of approaching depth in space, the way in which we stand in relation to others rather than by categorization. The right hemisphere has a tendency to deal with spatial relations in terms of degree of distance, which it can discriminate easily, in contrast with the strategy of the left hemisphere, which tends to be more categorical, above, below, and so on. There is a parallel here with the sense of time duration belongings to all the right hemisphere, while the sequencing before, after, equaling, above, and below belongs to the left. The right hemisphere's organization of space depends more on depth, whether things are nearer or further from me. The right hemisphere is even biased towards what lies further from me, an aspect of its broader, wider, and deeper attention. The left hemisphere, by comparison, has difficulty with processing depth. As a result, it may get the size of things wrong, sometimes dramatically.
Anybody ever had trouble trying to figure out which container leftovers will fit in? That would be your left hemisphere.
I practiced, and now I don't have a problem with that.
There are some examples that he gives, and right here and here, but this is a little bit more easier just because they give the patients examples of table. So these are tables as drawn by subjects. This is in normal conditions when both hemispheres are pinging. This is when their left hemisphere, and this is their right. And you can see some of the differences here, but the real test is, or the question I have, can you see their proclivities based off of that? Understanding the way that the right hemisphere understands depth and the left not so much. Looking at these drawings, can you see each individual here, which their proclivity naturally lie?
I don't know. Can you?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Oh, yes. Yes. Absolutely.
Macy.
How?
Okay. Well, so when you're looking at, let's say, the left hemisphere side and the right hemisphere side, just so we can see the differences to understand the whole a bit. The left hemisphere side is a bit more two-dimensional. Now, not always, like there are some where they still incorporate some aspects of depth, but in the right hemisphere, there's a bit more dimensions. And so when you're looking at it, the left will kind of work with just as much mundane kind of standard appreciation of this object, what a table is, right? Like what do we experience as a table? And some of it you can see it's like, well, that's not really entirely what we experience as a table. Whereas the right hemisphere in its drawing, it's a bit more akin to the realistic of like what an actual table looks like legit in terms of its space and dimensions. And so when you're looking over on the side of both, and Maddie's asking, can you figure out what kind of proclivity this person has, like now with their right and left hemisphere both in the play? And I'd say the person on the top left is definitely more left hemispheric proclivity. I'd say the person below them is also more,
why?
Well, because when you're looking at their their left hemisphere only, it's like way worse than when both are working. But there's still, I feel like there's still a bit more of an aspect of depth in this right hemisphere one, even if it's not just by a little. I'd say that maybe this person has a good ping, but I'd still say that there might be more left.
So with that reasoning or her understanding, Matthew, could you pinpoint this person's proclivity?
Well, I mean, I would say that it's left. It looks more like something that person would do from that middle drawing from the left hemisphere only. So it looks like a left proclivity. Not a lot of detail, basic elements, but no detail presented. So that would actually be right hemisphere since there's no detail. It's just the. I say left.
And is that a good consensus? Does everybody agree there? I see some nodding.
Well, I can see the legs don't have, there's no sense of, as you see in the right hemisphere, you got the legs, you got some larger legs. They're kind of giving more distance. You can have better depth perception when it kind of looks more real to something that you see every day. But this one's, you can see the lines aren't even connected in part of the table, so it doesn't really. It's to me it looks like a left hemisphere or something like that. But
yeah, that's a good consensus. Now, is there anybody out of these guys that either of you, we need a consensus, would be of the more right hemisphere proclivity?
Well, I'd say the weird one on the bottom is a bit strange to look at since all three drawings are very similar. They seem to be pretty integrated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would look at that as a good example of somebody who has a pretty healthy communication between their hemispheres. They ping frequently and they're relatively on the same page more often than, say, the person's hemispheres in the first row.
Mm-hmm.
How did they get the patient to turn off their left versus right hemisphere when they were drawing?
That's the WADA procedure. So you can actually incapacitate hemispheres with magnets, which plays into the frequency aspect of our antenna, the brain being a bit of an antenna too, right? So yeah, so they can literally inhibit one hemisphere to run the test. then let it get lit up, and then they'll shut down the other one and then run the sequence. So when you're looking at that individual on the bottom,
Wow.
yeah, it's neat. Like you're going to get more of this as we go through the book. That's why I don't like talking too much about it, because there's so much to discover and it's so beautiful to do. You have a right hemisphere proclivity thinker on the third one down, just due to all the extra and the depth that got put in like immediately, because they tried to go back to it again on the third picture where it was right hemisphere only, but there was like a lacking. It was almost like it was looking for more reference and it couldn't get it. So it went almost sort of like, if you were thinking about a right hand, because later on you're going to realize that the right hemisphere has the capability, is more capable, I should say, to do what the left hemisphere does. So because you can pass through a room and the context of the room will be entirely remembered, even in the subconscious of the right hemisphere, if it doesn't get access for the details that the left hemisphere can bring in the stasis of the experience, it can go into files, even though the left hemisphere is inhibited, to attempt to almost like reignite the emissary. So that's clearly the case in the third picture, the third row, far right, is the that particular right hemisphere was lacking some info, and so it didn't have as much to tap into, but it had made the attempt just based on the way the sequence of those drawings went. If the inhibiting was in the order that it's being listed, which I don't know, I would have to go into Nikolenko's. So I'd actually have to read the study, but anyways.
Interesting. I'm just shocked. I didn't know we could do that and consciously turn off an entire hemisphere through magnetism. And then, I mean, that sounds risky as sin right there.
But yeah, wait till you realize that they can do this with frequencies to manipulate us. You're gonna love that one.
Revolution in military affairs, baby. All right.
This is why they think we're hackable animals, man.
Yeah,
like this is the stuff.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's one of those, looking at these drawings, there's even more context that Kyle brought up.
Yeah, I was just about to have you bring that up because I wanted to do that thing. So if you scroll up to the flowers, just on the previous page on whoever's screen sharing. So similar idea, right? They're inhibiting the hemisphere. Like they give you the attempt of a person given to draw the thing. In this case, it's a flower, with their brain completely uninhibited with any intervention. And then they inhibit each hemisphere respectively to give you the other representations. And so what I found interesting about these, especially the bottom one, is it's like if you're looking at quality, the highest quality when no hemispheres are being inhibited whatsoever is the bottom row, so both on the left. But then when you take them and inhibit either hemisphere, you get a inferior image either way. Whereas in the previous examples, the left hemisphere is inferior both times, but the right hemisphere one, you actually looks better than when their brain is completely uninhibited. So what I find interesting about that is in the third row, you have somebody who's probably more artistically capable and disciplined, and they've accumulated more skill, right? So what that means is they started with a novel thing when they were first learning how to draw, when their right hemisphere taking the wheel, so to speak, as the novelty of the thing came into be. And as they got proficient, it started getting more and more handed over to the left hemisphere, because that's how you develop your skills. Left hemisphere deals with known, right hemisphere deals with novelty. So you take that more skillfully drawn image, remove the right hemisphere, and the left hemisphere no longer has the ability to draw in the context of all that practice and skill development to create the same type of sophisticated image. And interestingly still is now when the left hemisphere is completely negated and you have only the right hemisphere, it also can't duplicate the original photo because it no longer has the disciplined skill of the repetitive nature of what it took to become as proficient in that artistic field. And so both times you end up with an inferior image without them working together.
Yeah, and he talks about that even in music. There's a big section where he talks about just music and time, and this same principle that Kyle just explained. And I didn't think about it initially because I was looking at these ones and I went, I wonder if I can figure out their proclivities. But then it was that context, which is what Kyle brought in, which is what explains this one. And it's even as a musician, they talked about music in its essence is really a right hemisphere domain. It's the right hemisphere that can appreciate music. The appreciation for music and the activation that you see for the right hemisphere during listening to music and creation of it, it actually becomes more 50-50 and lessens. It becomes also left hemisphere activated as your proficiency as a musician gets higher. It's only the novel musician, somebody like me who's not, I haven't spent 10 years, I haven't been doing it since I was a kid, and those prodigies, for them, they would have more left hemisphere activation, like this individual with the flowers on the bottom row probably would, because they've disciplined it. So now it is not just the novelty and the experience, the embodiment of the right hemisphere. It is also the discipline and skills that the left hemisphere has brought into it, which is why the flower, when this person was pinging with both their hemispheres, is better than when it was just the right hemisphere. So even that playing into music, I thought that was really interesting how he differentiated. Even the right hemisphere of music appreciation is more emphasized when you have less experience within it. And I thought that was really neat. Is there anybody that has, Kyle, I know you took a lot of notes, and I could just keep going through mine because I took way too many, but is there a section that you really want to touch on that from all of your notes?
I could bring us back to page 64 when we were talking about intuition and deductive reasoning.
I wonder, while you're scrolling up, if anybody's ever done the test using this magnetic field that can shut off half of your brain to see if the subject who's not musically proficient was able to appreciate music after their right hemisphere was deactivated. I mean, there's so many things you could try out.
Well, interestingly, there's a short case study. I can't remember where it is in this chapter, but he talks about there's an individual who has a left hemisphere lesion, and they lose their ability to speak because the left hemisphere is predominant in the ability to speak with language. But when they were given music that had lyrics, in spite of the fact that they were no longer able to speak due to their left hemisphere being damaged, they could almost effortlessly recite the lyrics through the song as the right hemisphere took the wheel in a musical sense. So
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Anyways,
we can maybe track that down. I don't know if anybody knows where that section
I have
is.
screenshots on the music section. Of course I have screenshots on the music section.
Right.
We can give these a quick read over, and then we'll go back to page 64 just while Matthew's brain is there.
Let's do that.
The relation between music and the body is not by any means confined to voluntary or apparently voluntary movement of the limbs, as in dance. We are all aware of the many ways in which music affects us physically through our emotions. Musical phrases act like metaphors, emanating from and enormously expanding the meaning of movement in and of the body, rising, falling, pulsing, breathing. Many features of music, including obviously syncopations, but also melodic, I don't know how to say that, appoggiaturas, and inharmonic changes, set up patterns of expectation which are ultimately either confirmed or disappointed. And this process leads to physiological reactions such as alterations in breathing or changes in heart rate and blood pressure, and even in temperature, of which the right hemisphere and I think it's the parasympathetic nervous system. It deals with regulating the blood and heart rate. So even this physical modulation and trying to mediate what's happening to the body via music would still play into the right hemisphere reasoning why it has more of an activation with music. Changes in heart rate and blood pressure and even in temperature, as well as bringing us out in a sweat, bringing tears to our eyes or making our hair stand on end. Such changes are again mediated through the right hemisphere's vital connection with subcortical centers, with the hypothalamus, and with the body in general. Oh, this part's really cool. I'm just going to read this because this is really cool. It has been said that music, like poetry, is intrinsically sad, and a survey of music from many parts of the world would bear that out. Not, of course, that there is no joyful music, but that even such music often appears to be joy torn from the teeth of sadness, a sort of holiday of the minor key. It is what would expect in view of the emotional timbre of the right hemisphere, and there is a stronger affinity between the right hemisphere and the minor key, as well as between the left hemisphere and the major key. The pre-Socratic philosopher Gorgias wrote that awe and tearful pity and mournful desire enter those who listen to poetry, and at this time poetry and song were one. That's just so cool. The relationship between music and emotion is fascinating, and to some degree, baffling. Suzanne Langer said that music not only has the power to recall emotions we are familiar with, but to evoke emotions and moods we have not felt, passions we did not know before. Music seems, in other words, to expand the range of possible emotions limitlessly, because the emotion experienced is so bound up with the particularity of the work that mediates it, yet the lexicon with which we are obliged to describe the feelings remains frustratingly limited. Thus, the sadness of a piece of Bach will be quite different from the sadness of a piece of Mozart, and the sadness in the Matthew Passion will be different from the sort of sadness we might discern in the musical offering. And the sadness we experience in one movement of the Matthew Passion, the wonderful alto aria Ar Barme Dish, for example, will be a quite different kind from the sadness of, say, its final chorus. Wir sitzen jetzt mit Tränen nieder. This must be what Mendelssohn had meant by his otherwise paradoxical pronouncement that the thoughts that are expressed to me by music I love are not too indefinite to be put into words, but on the contrary, too definite. Language returns us inevitably to the worn currency of representation, in which the unique qualities of everything that exists are reduced to the same set of terms. As Nietzsche put it, compared with music, all communication by words is shameless. Words dilute and brutalize, words depersonalize, words make the uncommon common. Yeah, that was the end of that section.
Which is, I find that interesting because that is something the New World Order, globalist powers that be, what have you, that's something they desire to manipulate, the newspeak, it's a lot of the things that we, in order to even mentally, work through our deductive reasoning, we use language. Sometimes the language even limits what we're are thinking, or the different things we try to put into words to try to explain it to ourselves. And I feel like that's why even like Orwell's 1984, Eric Blair's 1984, it's the point is that if they can manipulate that to a degree, people can't, they can't actually try to visualize something. Even the word rebellion, there was no way to actually put something like that into words. So I guess they could have, that feeling, they could have the emotion of something like that, and yet the words, like Nietzsche was saying, they hold us back. I don't agree with everything that guy says, but it's interesting.
Right.
You find a lot of there's a lot of truth to that, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and it's not only like destroying words, but also limiting them into some oversimplistic category, like sadness, like he was getting at. The reality is sadness is a very rich, diverse concept that we use this one limited word, but most people don't have. It's like we were saying with number, right? They just have this one limited definition, but no, the sadness that you get from St. John's Passion of Bach versus the St. Matthews or a Mendelssohn quartet, it's going to be a different it's a different sadness. It's a different, and it'll awaken different things inside of us, or introduce different things, or recall different feelings differently, right? Depending on which composition we're being moved by. So the same thing for like Orwell. Like, it's not like the word freedom isn't necessarily allowed. You could still use the word freedom in the Orwellian newspeak, but it's just that it means slavery. Like, so the definition of it is just highly limited and turned inside out.
Yeah, and what Jeremiah, what you just kind of alluded to, it goes on, and it not only goes on to expand what you just alluded to, but it also kind of gives more examples about Matthew, your question regarding some of the effects of lesions in music in the hemispheres. So, Dad, if you want to continue reading right here for me.
Though speech is principally a left hemisphere function, the production of words in song is associated with wide activation of the right hemisphere. Following a left hemisphere stroke, which leaves the patient unable to speak, he or she may be able to sing the words of songs without difficulty. Damage to the right hemisphere, by contrast, can lead to a condition known as amusia, in which the ability to appreciate and understand or to perform music may be lost. Right hemisphere lesions may leave the understanding of speech relatively unaffected, while the perception of nonverbal sounds, including music, is profoundly disrupted. In such cases, as well as in auditory agnosia, which is commoner following bilateral damage, the perception of timbre, rhythm, and complex sounds is badly affected. Most cases of amusia without aphasia, inability to appreciate or perform music, but without impairment of speech comprehension or production, involve right hemisphere damage. The reverse situation depends on the right hemisphere being spared. A well-known composer and a professor of music at Moscow Conservatory, Vissarion Shabalin, had a left temporal and parietal stroke with consequent severe aphasia, impairment of language, but carried on composing works of excellent quality. According to Shostakovich, indistinguishable from his pre-stroke works, which I find amazing. A professional organist and composer who was blind from the age of 2 had a left middle cerebral artery stroke with consequent severe aphasia, as well as alexia and agraphia, inability to read or write in Braille for words, but not for music, and carried on playing and composing unaffected. A composer and a conductor who had a left hemisphere stroke was no longer able to read words, but could read and write music without difficulty.
Huh.
Boom.
Yeah, and as far as I'm pretty sure if Matthew, you're going to read along. Once you catch up to this section, there is a part of that says that's not the case for if there's right hemisphere damage. Pretty much all of that appreciating that musical ability is gone. Whereas, as you just saw, all these examples of people that had left hemisphere lesions and damage in various circumstances, music could still remain alive. That's why even why do you think that so many kids that have Asperger's or they're supposedly autistic and or they're blind, yet they look like and function completely normal human beings when you put them into a musical setting and you put a piano in front of them, and then all of that's just gone. It's like the right hemisphere.
Cody Lee
is a really good example. I don't actually know what he had, but he, talking, he couldn't see was difficult, and he had, tremors, but as soon as you put him in front of a piano, he could play it and he could sing, and it was like an entirely other individual. Because it was an entirely other hemisphere. Okay, I digress. Any questions regarding that section, or I think we feel fulfilled from that, as I know I do. Talking about music just gets me giddy every time.
I just shared a little article that we published on atonalism a few weeks ago, and it's pretty good in terms of just getting at this author is himself a composer and musician. He's got a little teaching school in the US on for autistic kids. I gotta talk to him again. Maybe he'll give a class. And he basically did this whole series of articles on the origins of atonal music as this, artificial deconstruction of human minds, and just going through the CIA funding of this new movement through Schoenberg and Adorno and this whole movement, which wanted to remove melody completely and just basically introduce sort of an idea of irrationalism as what governs beauty. So beauty essentially becomes increasingly ugliness, and you can't really discern one from the other. And if you get the whole artistic world into that place where they're not able to uh listen to one composition and appreciate it, they're not able to judge anything as right or wrong. They have no ability to cast value judgments, and that's a society that's going to be ripe for all sorts of manipulations. And there's this one artist who's a classical pianist, and he had played Schoenberg, and he did a demo in front of an audience of musically inclined people at some conservatory in France, and he played this 10-minute sample of Schoenberg, this super well-known piece, and he fucked it up like intentionally 75 times. And then he played like a little tiny 3-minute sample from Mozart and made like 2 screw ups, right? Not a single person in this musically proficient audience was able to pick up any of the mistakes he made in this well-known Schoenberg piece. And yet everybody, even if you didn't have a musical ear, would be able to pick up the errors in the Mozart piece that was full of melody, whereas the Schoenberg one, it's all just like random sounds. So
That's cool.
Yeah, it's just like as soon as there's discord, it's immediately obvious when you have an actual harmonic resonance going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put that link in the description. Okay, Kyle, what was the section that you wanted to bring up?
Okay, so it's on page 64. Well, it's like the very, very bottom of page 64, and then it trails on to 65 for a bit. It's like the beginning of this section labeled reason versus rationality. I don't know if the Kindle version is. Yeah, there we go. Okay, cool. The Kindle version is formatted differently, so that's perfect. Despite the right hemisphere's overwhelmingly important role in emotion, the popular stereotype that the left hemisphere has a monopoly on reason, like the view that it has the monopoly on language, is mistaken. As always, it's a question not of what, but of in what way. In fact, reasoning is of different kinds, and though linear sequential argument is clearly better executed by the left hemisphere, some types of reasoning, including deduction and some types of mathematical reasoning, are mainly dependent on the right hemisphere. More explicit reasoning is underwritten by the left hemisphere. Less explicit reasoning, such as is often involved in problem solving, including scientific and mathematical problem solving, by the right hemisphere. There is a relation between the pleasurable aha phenomenon of insight in the right amygdala, which mediates interactions between emotions and higher frontal cognitive function. In fact, an extensive body of research now indicates that insight, whether mathematical or verbal, the sort of problem solving that happens when we are precisely not concentrating on it, is associated with activation in the right hemisphere, mainly in the right anterior temporal area, specifically in the right anterior superior temporal gyrus, though where there are higher levels of restructuring involved, there is also activity in the right prefrontal cortex. Insight is also a perception of the previous incongruity of one's assumptions, which links it to the right hemisphere's capacity for deducing an anomaly.
Well said.
It makes me think of like the pinging idea that McGilchrist talks about between the way the 2 hemispheres communicate, where you start with, well, depending on if you start on a left hemisphere place or a right hemisphere place determines the way they communicate. But the whole deductive reasoning part being a right hemisphere responsibility, it's like it seems that way because the right hemisphere is the only one that can actually manifest continuity of thought. It's the only one that can understand time in a way to actually go down a proper path of reasoning rather than trying to hyper focus in on one singular point.
Can I ask what is deductive reasoning again?
Yeah, when I looked up Jeremiah, do you have an answer for this one?
Well, not really. Well, just from my experience with like geometry and stuff, I think that was something that Abraham Lincoln took geometry in order to just understand deductive reasoning. It's the fact of using a premise or a self-evident truth. So you use something that's, a lot of mathematics is based off of, something you have you have the foundation of what you're working on, and you're kind of building up on that. So I think it's like, if man is mortal and Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's what deductive reasoning is. And different thing is like is a little bit different. You're more, it's kind of more intuitive, where you're saying that if this is true, then if all school buses are yellow, therefore all buses might be yellow. So it's not necessarily as accurate as deductive reasoning should be. That's why the Greeks were always more leaning towards deductive reasoning, but that's at least how I understand it.
One of those that you mentioned is a syllogism, and that would be the left hemisphere. I would say, from what I've understood about deductive reasoning, is that it is in relation to other things. So when you're going into problem solving, the right hemisphere will pull in context. So similar to an exercise that recently our whole family did when Matthew was visiting with us, was putting yourself in a position where you have the circle, you get your sort of your diameter line, and then through reason to try to create the circle to be within the square. And so, or sorry, the square to be within the circle. Well, I mean, either way, actually, just the relationship of these different geometrical shapes, a deductive reasoning is not necessarily placing everything into sequence, because that would be the left hemisphere's version of a deduction. I deduce this thing from these other things, but the right hemisphere's version of deduction is in relation to, and through those relations you get somewhere. That's my take on the understanding of deductive reasoning in a non-Webster dictionary format, because I don't necessarily like submitting to just dictionary formats, because that's the left hemisphere's wheelhouse.
Yeah. When I first, because Matthew in Science Unshackled, your phenomenal book, you go into inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning, and when I read it, I was like, why do we do either of those things? But when looking at McGilchrist's application of it, the deductive reasoning, kind of like both Jeremiah and Mike did kind of concluded, was that deductive reasoning almost relies on inferences, like deductive inferences. And the inference is the thing that's in relation to that it depends upon. So if you don't have an inference initially to work off of context, then the deduction doesn't work. And in the example Dad gave about the geometry exercise, the inference was the diagonal line across the circle. That if inferring that remains consistent for all circles, only then can we deduce that it is logical to do another circle built off of that circumference, and then continue to solve the problem. That's where I concluded based off of what everybody else kind of said here.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that was even, I think, like Euclid, one of the greatest men that ever lived. He set out on a mission to pretty much, prove every mathematical or geometric equation to be true using 100 theorems. I believe it was 100 theorems. So it's like logic chains based on self-evident truths. And there's only a few self-evident truths in math. Well, at least in, algebraic kind of math, you're using if A is equal to B, then B is equal to A. It's pretty simple stuff like that. And if a line takes up no space and is kind of like, if a line is straight, there's a lot of, or even a point, it takes up no space. That's like a self-evident truth. It's not supposed to, you're putting it on a page. It's not supposed to represent the space taking it up. It's supposed to represent that single coordinate in plane or whatever in a space. And then from that, you got your baseline, like you were saying, the line in your circle, you're working off of that, and you're able to prove with a logic chain or what they call a theorem, which is really interesting. I find that cool.
It's to me, with the deductive reasoning so far, based on what you guys are explaining, is it sounds like going from to really left hemisphere. I'm sorry, generally specific, but there's something in there that's a little bit really key to our relationship with people, because he was talking about emotion being linked to deductive reasoning a lot, and problem solving. And it kind of reminds me where it's like music. I almost kind of feel like people are in a sense kind of like music, where it's like you have this thing where it's not that anything can go, like you have a piece, and it has this transformative aspect to it. It's not just meant for you to look on the past pushing for predictivity in the future. It's a sense of consistency, but transformativity as well. And I feel like almost like adaptivity when it comes to music. So when it comes to relationships as well, it's like it's distinctly, because it is not everything goes, that makes it unique. There is something that is existing and in part is still being played out, and that's why I feel like we can even have those instances where something can feel atonal and feel off, because it's like there's some form of consistency, but it's not necessarily that as you progress in the song, it's predictive. It is and it isn't. It's also transformative, right? And that's almost like what it feels like with a relationship.
Yeah.
Hence why you can look at a person and be like, I feel like I have like an essence, and the left hemisphere's mistake is thinking that that's static, right? But there's also, like us, like a song, there's a transformative aspect, and it's not just predictability, it's consistency on top of transcendence. So I feel like that's going from what the right hemisphere is very akin to is individual discrimination of uniqueness, which is what the right hemisphere is very familiar with. So that general to specific is more like, well, there's something individually unique about all of you. It's precisely in it's like a music or art. It could have been anything starting out, but it is precisely that it is not anything that makes it beautiful, rich, and deep. It's like it could have been a blank slate, but it's precisely that it's not, which makes you all unique and individuals. So yeah.
That was so lovely, and he totally talks about that right here, which is why I pulled it up. There's an ambiguity in the idea of permanence. The left hemisphere seems to accept the permanence of something only if it is static. But things can change, flow, and yet have permanence. Think of a river. The right hemisphere perceives that there is permanence even when there is flow. Hence, when it is damaged, living beings have no permanence. The McGilchrist phenomenon. Music takes place in time, yet music also has the capacity to make us stand outside time. As George Steiner put it, music is time made free of temporality. Equally, it works through the body, but transports us beyond the world of the merely physical. It is highly particular, and yet seems to speak of things that are universal. Perhaps this going through a thing to find its opposite is an aspect of the right hemisphere world, in which opposites are not incompatible, an aspect of its roundedness rather than linearity. However, I would say, at the risk of pushing language to or beyond its proper limits, that time itself is what the left hemisphere would call paradoxical in nature, and that music does not so much free time from temporality as brings out an aspect that is always present within time, its intersection with a moment which partakes of eternity. Similarity, it does not so much use the physical to transcend physicality, or use particularity to transcend the particular, as bring out the spirituality latent in what we conceive as physical existence, and uncover the universality that is, as Goff spent a lifetime trying to express, always latent in the particular. It is also a feature of music in every known culture, that it is used to communicate with the spiritual, with whatever is by definition above, beyond, other than ourselves.
I have a question. When it says perhaps this going through a thing to find its opposite is an aspect of the right hemisphere world, what does that mean?
What did he say before that? What's the sentence prior to that?
Okay, this is the thing in question.
Oh, right, because you have to, your body is being moved by the musical vibrations, the frequency. So it's going through your body, your senses are picking it up, but it's to transcend beyond the senses. So you're the good music, I guess, the of that category, that he's this divine music will transport you beyond the limitations of the sensual domain of the particulars to something more universal that is beyond the parts that make us up as a body.
Yeah, and the right hemisphere, that's its world. It's open to the other, and almost most importantly, it's open to the other than itself. Whereas the left hemisphere is about bringing everything back to the self, right? Its favorite subject is itself. Whereas the experience, the right hemisphere, when acting as the master, will allow us to go through a musical experience to its completion, even though it's not complete. Like and the left hemisphere will try to yank you out of it to get you to analyze it, because the left hemisphere has no connection to an embodied experience, or sorry, it's incomplete in interpreting an embodied experience, would be a more accurate way of describing it.
Yeah, it reminds me, this is also a concept explored, Matthew, in your book, Science and Child. But Minky, you and I allude to it all the time. It's the idea that unity makes room for division, love makes room for hate. Opposites, the right hemisphere, if you look at each hemisphere, you would think total opposites, two entirely different worlds. However, the right hemisphere still makes room for the left hemisphere. It nurtures it because it knows that it needs it. The left hemisphere is meant to enrich the right hemisphere, help it do its job better, because the right hemisphere is master. So the right hemisphere brings up the left, saying, help me be a better me. So when he says that the right hemisphere's domain of opposites not being incompatible, that's the very definition of what the right hemisphere does. Is it looks at the left hemisphere and says, we're not incompatible. We can be compatible. That is its hope. That is part of the reason why Dad always talks about the frogs getting killed, is that it believes and will always believe that the scorpion can be compatible, and together they can get across the river as mates, rather than opponents. And so
it's funny because it's almost like, even if you were to provide the right hemisphere with factual knowledge of what the left hemisphere is, because it doesn't even think in that way, it's going to always see potential, irregardless of the fact that only our left hemispheres would describe our left hemispheres as static things. Like the way we're describing what the hemispheres do is us putting them in temporary stasis for now, right? But all of our right hemispheres know that there could be potential expansion, right? And so that's why it still does this thing for the left, because it's like, well, there could be expansion, even if necessarily we would also be like, but factually there isn't.
The frog knows the scorpion's along for the ride, but it also knows that it can get betrayed. And that's the part that's interesting about that metaphor and how it plays into, like, one of the reasons, what is our action? We're going through this work and we're looking at this, and Gilchrist is setting the stage for bringing you further into this discovery of the symphony that is your brain. And then you'll get an understanding of how this ends up manifesting from micro to medio to macro in your own daily life. Everything from picking up a glass of water or making a fine tune when fixing an engine or things along those lines. But then how does this play out in relationships, and then into culture, and then into politics? And then when you have individuals that set up systems for narcissistical self-gain. Like now you have this perpetuating schizophrenic culture that is left hemisphere hall of mirrors. And that's what's ultimately speaking, these small stasis moments that Macy's described are accurate in order to help enrich, and the right hemisphere knows this instinctively. It's an intuition. Like the reason why we come up with the saying of, well, based on what I've seen and mathematically or sequentially or with a formula. But you'll also have those people be like, oh, wait, with all that in mind, what does your gut tell you? And then all of a sudden the reasoning in the left hemisphere is like, what is it? No, you don't make decisions based on your gut. And it's like, no, you don't solely make decisions based on your gut, but you should not ignore the embodiment, the frequency, that X factor, the unknown. This is where God lives with you, part of you, extended within you and out from you. And so, yeah, it's just, yeah, you're going to fall in love with your mind, and then you're going to see where the scorpion is in all of us.
Okay, with that beautiful, beautiful lead in, Macy, you brought us in with a summary. I would like you to take us out with a conclusion. Will you read this last bit for us?
Okay. Okay. However, as I also emphasized at the outset, both hemispheres take part in virtually all functions to some extent, and in reality, both are always engaged. I do not wish to leave the impression that it might be a good thing if the entire population had a left hemisphere stroke. I take it for granted that the contributions made by the left hemisphere to language and systematic thought in particular are invaluable. Our talent for division, for seeing the parts, is of staggering importance, second only to our capacity to transcend it in order to see the whole. These gifts of the left hemisphere have helped us achieve nothing less than civilization itself, with all that means. Even if we could abandon them, which of course we can't, we would be fools to do so and would come off infinitely the poorer. There are siren voices that call us to do exactly that. Certainly to abandon clarity and precision, which in any case, importantly, depend on both hemispheres. And I want to emphasize that I am passionately opposed to them. We need the ability to make fine discriminations and to use reason appropriately, but these contributions need to be made in the service of something else that only the right hemisphere can bring. Alone, they are just destructive, and right now they may be bringing us close to forfeiting the civilization they helped to create.
Here, here.
Here, here. Yeah, thank you for coming, Matthew and Jeremiah, even though you were late. Like, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Happy Easter, everybody. I'm gonna have to run off to a little family thing now. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Good night.
Yeah,
Good night,
see ya.
everybody.
Bye.
Take care.